Have you ever found yourself in an abandoned place and wondered what it must have looked like when it was busy? More than that, have you ever wondered what used to happen there and what the story of the place might be? Questions like that fascinate us, and so do the strange abandoned places around the world, with all the secrets they keep. In this video, you're about to see a collection of some of our favorites. Most of the Antarctic is abandoned from a human occupancy point of view. The inhospitable conditions there don't lend themselves well to habitation. Even the bases we built on the ice for people to live in aren't occupied all year round. Take the British Antarctic Survey's Halley 6 research station, for example. Between November and February each year, you'll find a research team living and working at the station. But for the rest of the year, as temperatures dip to a frigid minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, there's nobody there at all other than a colony of emperor penguins living nearby. That doesn't stop the station from going about its work, though. Since 2017, the station has been semi-automated and continues to measure atmospheric chemistry and space weather all alone in the cold and the dark. The data is digitally relayed to a team based in Cambridge, England. The system works so well that it may soon no longer be necessary for any people to come here at all, leaving Halley 6 lifeless and empty. Tombs, by their very nature, are supposed to be abandoned. The idea of them is that when someone dies, they get locked away in the tomb, and they're left to rest for all eternity. As humans are a curious race, we have a habit of disturbing ancient tombs in the hope of finding something interesting or revealing inside of them. Sometimes we strike lucky, as we did when a 1,400-year-old tomb full of bizarre monster paintings was opened in China in 2017. It's been nicknamed the Tomb of the Blue Monster, and looking at these pictures, it's easy to see why. Nothing that looks anything like this blue monster has been recorded in any other ancient Chinese tomb, and experts are at a loss to explain what it might be supposed to represent. Unfortunately, identifying the occupant of the burial chamber, which is in Hsinchu City, hasn't been possible. It appears that the tomb was looted in the past, and any identifying markers were stolen. The numerous murals of horses, hunters, and tradespeople suggest that the occupant might have been a rich merchant, but that's only a guess. While we're talking about ancient and mysterious tombs, check out this one, perched in the mountains of Wicklow, Ireland. It's the Seafen Passage Tomb, and it's more than 5,300 years old. At the tomb's entrance, you'll find two diamond shapes carved into the rocks as markers. There's also a stone on the roof that's been marked with 5 clearly defined lines. Nobody has any idea what the symbols might mean or who made them. Based on peat profiling of the surrounding area, it seems that there was a settlement close to the tomb during the Neolithic era, but the settlement is long gone. Oddly, when Seafen Passage Tomb was first excavated in 1931, no human remains were found inside it. Archaeologists aren't sure what to make of that. It may mean the remains were removed in the distant past, or that the tomb was never used for its intended purpose. There's also the possibility that we've misunderstood the building, and it's not actually a tomb at all, but archaeologists prefer not to think about that too hard. Tombstones, as we all know, tend to be made of stone. It's sometimes an ornate form of stone, such as marble, but they're stone all the same. That's why they're called tombstones. Apparently, this rule doesn't apply in the village of Bazyakovo in Tatarstan, Russia, where you'll find a mysterious abandoned church overgrown with weeds. Push the weeds aside to get a better look at the tombstones, and you'll find that many of them are made from cast iron. Based on the dates stamped onto the tombstones, most of them were laid during the 19th century. That makes it doubly surprising that they're still there, as during the 20th century, iron was in such high demand that even the iron fences and crosses of some churches were scrapped and taken for use by the military. Chillingly, there's a skull and crossbones on one of the iron grave markers, without any written explanation of what it's doing there. Perhaps it's the final resting place of an infamous pirate. Right next to the abandoned church and graveyard is an abandoned school, beyond which are a few abandoned houses. The whole place has a distinctly eerie atmosphere. The German occupation of Poland came to an end many decades ago, but the scars that it left are still visible all over the land. One of them goes by the name of Muchołapka, which also goes by the name of Hitler's Stonehenge. Nobody's quite sure what it is or what it was supposed to be. The giant decagon, made of concrete, is on the side of a Polish mountain, close to Silesia, and might have been abandoned in a state of semi-completion. Its intended purpose must have been a grand one because the pillars of the octagon stand 30 feet high, but no clues have been left behind to help us work it out. Even the name Muchołapka is an affectation. It means flytrap, and it was given to the location by the first Polish journalist to investigate the site in the years after the war. Beneath the giant decagon is a network of tunnels known as Project Riza, which were dug by prisoners of war. The tunnels are presumably connected to the intended function of the structure above them, but nobody knows how. One guess is that it would eventually have become a water tower, but that wouldn't explain the tunnels. Moving across Poland, we find a beautiful abandoned fairy tale castle in Lipalis. Not only is this palatial building abandoned, but it suffered the indignity of being abandoned before it was ever completed. Nobody has ever lived in it. Although it looks like something from the Middle Ages, the story of Lipalis Castle starts in 1979. The Polish artist Piotr Kazimierzak planned for it to be both his home and his studio, and also a place to entertain and impress guests with a swimming pool and a ballroom. As a devout Christian, Piotr called for the construction to feature 12 towers to represent the 12 apostles of the Bible. His project was far too ambitious and far too costly. He ran out of money not long after completing the exterior of the castle, at which point he also ran into trouble with the local authorities because he hadn't applied for the correct permits to start the building work. Piotr is still alive, and it's said by some that he still intends to finish the castle one day. Looking at the state of it, it's more likely that he'd have to rip it down and start again. If you know anything about American geography, you'll know that Oklahoma is landlocked. How, then, can it be the case that there's an enormous blue whale in Catoosa? Well, for a start, the whale isn't real. It's a whimsical model, built by an eccentric man named Hugh Davis as a wedding gift for his wife in 1972. We don't know what his wife made of the unconventional gift, but we do know that it's since become a landmark for the drivers who pass it every day on Route 66. The whale sits in a pond, and Davis's vision was that his sculpture would also serve as a play slide for the children who often dived and swam in the pond. It became a popular attraction to the point where Hugh opened a small concession stand, serving drinks and snacks next to the whale during the 1980s. By the 1990s, with Hugh no longer around, it had fallen into disrepair, becoming nothing more than a sad curiosity on the roadside. More recently, it's been earmarked for restoration and will hopefully reopen to visitors soon. Rosie's Diner in Cedar Springs, Michigan opened in 1946 and was once recognized as the most iconic diner in the United States of America. The USA is dotted with diners like this, but Rosie's became famous after a series of television commercials for Bounty paper towels were filmed inside it, starring a character known as Rosie the Waitress. Those commercials caught the eyes of marketing executives at Pepsi, who also shot a commercial there during the 1970s. Owner Ralph Corrado Jr. was ready to sell his diner and retire by the 1990s, but an effort to persuade the Smithsonian Institute to acquire it on the grounds of its historical and cultural significance failed. Instead, it was bought by artist Jerry Berta, who moved it to its current location from its original berth in Little Ferry, New Jersey. He added a second dining car, an art gallery, and a putting course at the rear of the diner. That incarnation of the business lasted until 2006, when it was sold again. But the new owners struggled to make money with Rosie's, and it shut down permanently in 2011. Attempts to sell it to a nonprofit organization for preservation continue to this day, but sadly, after 9 years of abandonment, it suffered severe water damage. You might have heard of the Cavern Club in Liverpool, England. It's famous for being the first place that the Beatles ever played, but it's far from the only cavern worth looking at in the city. There are also the Williams tunnels running below the city streets. They were dug out during the 19th century, and so little is known about them that even most of the city's residents don't know that they're there. The tunnels are named for Joseph Williamson, who was a successful tobacco trader in Liverpool during the early 1800s. As a recession hit England after the Napoleonic Wars, Williams started paying for tunnels to be dug underground as of 1817. Nobody knows what his true motive for doing so was, but some people believe that he was trying to use his money for good. Many of the soldiers who came back from the war struggled to find employment, so Williamson paid them to dig tunnels just for the sake of giving them something to do. By 1840, the work had stopped, and the tunnels were abandoned, after which the city's council started using them to store waste, trash, and rubble from demolished buildings above ground. Nobody knows how far they run on for. Excavation work to remove the rubble started in 1918 and is still ongoing. There may be tunnels under Liverpool, but there's a whole underground city beneath Nour in France, one that's been there since the 9th century. Nour is a sleepy village, home to around 1,200 people. In the distant past, there were more than 3 times as many people living in the network of limestone tunnels, caves, and passageways that run below it. Initially, the underground city was nothing more than a quarry, but during the 9th and 10th centuries, villagers began to take refuge inside of it to hide from roving barbarians and other invaders. They began to build lives down there and dug further into the rock to create extra space. This carried on until the 17th century, by which time the population was around 5,000 people, living between 300 rooms, along with space for livestock, 3 churches, and a bakery 72 feet underground. Smoke from the bakery was deliberately redirected through existing structures above ground to keep the existence of the people living below a secret. At some point over the next century, the population moved out, and the underground village was forgotten about completely until 1887 when it was found again. It was briefly reoccupied during both World Wars, but aside from that, its only visitors since then have been tourists. Earlier on, we looked at an abandoned Russian churchyard. Now, here's a whole abandoned Russian village. It's called Andriivsty, and you'll find it in the outback of the Udmurt forests. You might struggle to find it on a map. It's miles from any other settlement, and it's little more than a loose arrangement of rickety old wooden houses, with an equally rickety wooden church at its center. Looking at these images of it, it would be easy to believe that nobody's lived here for 100 years or more. In reality, it's barely been a decade since the last resident moved out. Rural life continued here for decades after industrialization reached the bulk of Russia, but the lack of any shops or a road connection to the rest of the country forced people to move away one by one. The younger generation left. The older generation who didn't want to move eventually passed away, and eventually Andriivsty was left in silence. Today, the buildings are slowly collapsing, watched only by a few bemused cows who've been left in a nearby field. Those of you who don't live in England probably imagine that Buckingham Palace, home of the Queen, is the grandest mansion in the country. That isn't the case. The largest mansion in the country is in Sussex, has never been lived in, and has been abandoned for almost 20 years. £40 million, the equivalent of $53 million, has been spent on the palace since construction work began on it 35 years ago. The mansion was to be known as Hamilton Palace and was built by the order of disgraced slum landlord and property tycoon Nicholas van Hoogstraten. Van Hoogstraten fired a succession of builders, architects, and other professionals who worked on the palace because he was displeased with their efforts, and then building work stopped completely in 2001. Despite the convicted criminal's insistence that the project hasn't been abandoned, He's now in his mid-70s, and the property has entered a state of disrepair. It seems unlikely that it will ever be finished, and even if it isn't torn down, it may eventually fall down of its own volition. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.